They called him Father Mike. Not Sergeant. Not Ranger. Not the man who had earned 3 Purple Hearts in places the Army still won't name. Just Father Mike, the soft-spoken chaplain who held services on Sunday and handed out pocket Bibles like candy. He was 52 years old, thin at the shoulders, gray at the temples, with hands that folded easily in prayer. When he walked through Camp Stryker in Afghanistan, soldiers nodded out of politeness, not respect. He wasn't one of them. Not really. He didn't carry a rifle. He didn't run drills. He didn't curse or spit or talk about firefights over chow. Father Mike's nice, one soldier said once, as if nice was all that needed saying. Nice, harmless, forgettable. On a forward operating base where every conversation competed with helicopter blades and diesel engines, Father Mike's voice disappeared. He spoke quietly, always with that patient tone people use when they've long since stopped expecting to be heard. He held services in a plywood chapel that fit 8 people if they squeezed. Most weeks 4 showed up. Sometimes 2. Once, nobody came at all, and Father Mike sat alone for an hour, Bible open on his lap, waiting. Chaplain's wasting his time, a lieutenant muttered. Half these guys don't even believe anymore. But Father Mike kept showing up. Every Sunday. Every memorial. Every time a young soldier sat outside the barracks at 2 in the morning, staring at nothing. He'd walk up slow, sit down without asking, and say nothing unless spoken to. Most times the soldier would get up and leave. Sometimes they'd talk. Rarely they'd cry. And Father Mike never judged. Never pushed. Just sat. Just listened. Just existed in the space where no one else wanted to be. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Father Mike hadn't always been Father Mike. 25 years earlier, he'd been Sergeant Michael Hayes, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. He'd jumped out of planes in the dark, kicked down doors in Mogadishu, fought in places that didn't make the news because officially, no one had been there. He'd been good at it. Too good maybe. The kind of soldier who could clear a room in 4 seconds, who never hesitated, who carried his brothers out when they fell and went back in for more. He'd earned 3 Purple Hearts, not because he was reckless, but because he refused to leave anyone behind. The first came in Somalia. A bullet through the shoulder while dragging a wounded medic to cover. He was back on the line in 6 weeks. The second came in Kosovo. Shrapnel from a grenade that should have killed him but only tore up his leg. He was back in 8 weeks. The third came in a valley in Afghanistan that no map acknowledged. An RPG hit close enough to throw him 10 feet and rupture his eardrum. He was back in 10 weeks. But the fourth wound, the one that didn't come with a medal, that one never healed. It happened on a raid. A compound. Intel said high-value target, minimal civilians. Intel was wrong. When the smoke cleared and the shooting stopped, Michael Hayes stood in a doorway, looking at the cost of being too good at his job. He didn't speak for 3 days. When he did, he told his commanding officer he was done. Not broken. Not traumatized. Just done. I've taken enough lives, he said. I want to save some. He left the Rangers. Went to seminary. Studied theology the way he'd once studied combat tactics. Quiet, thorough, relentless. 4 years later he was ordained. And when the Army asked if he'd come back as a chaplain, he said yes. Not to fight. To heal. But at Camp Stryker nobody knew that story. They saw the collar, not the scars. They saw the Bible, not the Ranger tab he'd never put back on. To them, Father Mike was just the guy who prayed while real soldiers did the work. Father, you ever think about carrying a weapon? A young private asked once, half joking. Every day, Father Mike said quietly. The private laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The base had a rhythm. Morning formation. Patrols. Guard shifts. Chapel. The days blurred together in dust and routine. Father Mike moved through them like a shadow, present but unnoticed. He spent mornings at the aid station sitting with wounded soldiers. He didn't preach. He just listened. Sometimes he'd read a letter from home if a soldier's hands were too bandaged to hold it. Sometimes he'd just sit. Afternoons, he walked the perimeter, checking in with soldiers on guard duty. The loneliest posts got the longest visits. He'd bring water, a candy bar, a paperback book. Small things. Most soldiers didn't thank him. Some told him to leave. He always smiled and said, "I'll be around if you need me." Evenings he wrote letters. Dozens of them. To families of the fallen. To mothers who'd lost sons. To wives who'd lost husbands. His handwriting was careful, each sentence weighed. He never lied. Never said it was quick or painless if it wasn't. But he always found something true and kind to say about the men he prayed over. At night, when the base went quiet except for the hum of generators, Father Mike sat alone in his quarters. A small room. A cot. A desk. A shelf with theology books and one battered Ranger handbook he'd never thrown away. On the wall, a single photo. His old unit, 25 years younger, all of them smiling, half of them dead now. He didn't pray for himself. He prayed for them. The ones still fighting. The ones still dying. The ones who didn't know how to stop. In the chow hall, soldiers joked at his expense without malice. It was easy humor, the kind that filled silence. "Hey Father, can you bless this mystery meat? I think it's moving." "Father Mike, if I confess now, can I sin later?" "Chaplain, you ever actually been in a firefight?" He smiled at all of it. Never corrected. Never defended. Just kept eating, kept nodding, kept being the punchline. It didn't bother him. He'd been called worse things in worse places. Words didn't wound him anymore. But there were moments, brief, fleeting, when something would shift in his eyes. A helicopter passing overhead. The crack of distant gunfire. The smell of burning fuel. For just a second, the soft-spoken chaplain would disappear, and something older, harder, colder would surface. Then it would pass, and Father Mike would be Father Mike again. One afternoon, a young sergeant approached him outside the chapel. The sergeant's name was Torres, 23 years old, 2 deployments, already exhausted by the weight of leadership. "Father, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you do it?" "Stay calm all the time. Like nothing gets to you." Father Mike looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not calm, son. I'm just practiced." "Practiced at what?" "Carrying weight without letting people see it." Torres didn't understand. Not yet. But he would. The days continued. Routine. Predictable. Safe as a combat zone could be. Father Mike kept his quiet vigil, and the base kept not noticing. Until the day the helicopter fell from the sky. It was 1,400 hours. Clear sky. Routine supply run. The Black Hawk lifted off from the FOB, heavy with cargo and 12 soldiers rotating back to the main base for a week of rest. 12 men who'd survived their deployment. 12 men going home. The explosion came without warning. A catastrophic mechanical failure, the kind that happens 1 in 10,000 flights. The tail rotor disintegrated. The helicopter spun, wild and violent, corkscrewing toward the ground. It hit hard. Metal screamed. Fuel ignited. The impact cratered the earth half a mile outside the wire, in open ground between the base and hostile territory. Alarms shrieked. Soldiers poured out of barracks. The QRF, Quick Reaction Force, scrambled, but the armored vehicles needed 5 minutes to load and roll. Medevac birds needed 10 to spin up. Command needed a situation report before committing resources. Everyone moved fast. But in a disaster, fast is never fast enough. The wreckage burned. Black smoke rose in a pillar, visible from every corner of the base. On the tower, a spotter called it in. Bird down. Half a click outside the wire. Unknown casualties. Possible hostile activity in the area. Possible. That single word changed everything. If hostiles were near, protocol demanded caution. Assess. Plan. Secure. Don't rush into an ambush. The QRF loaded weapons, checked comms, coordinated with Overwatch. 5 minutes became 7. 7 became 10. In the operations center, officers argued over maps and risk assessments. In the wreckage, men were dying. Father Mike heard the explosion from the chapel. He ran outside, saw the smoke, heard the sirens. Soldiers sprinted past him toward the motor pool. He stood still for 1 second, 2, calculating the same math everyone else was calculating. 12 men. Half a mile. 10 minutes minimum before help arrived. He turned and walked, not ran, walked, to his quarters. Opened his footlocker. Pulled out something he hadn't touched in years. A medical kit. One. Civilian. But organized with the precision of someone who'd used it under fire. He slung it over his shoulder, stepped outside, and started walking toward the gate. A private saw him. "Father, where are you going?" "To the crash site." "Sir, the QRF isn't even rolling yet. It's not secure." "I know." "Father, you can't." But Father Mike was already gone, walking through the gate, past the stunned guards, out into open ground where the chaplain wasn't supposed to go. The guards looked at each other. One grabbed a radio. Ops, be advised, the chaplain just walked outside the wire toward the crash site. Alone. Unarmed. In the operations center, a major blinked. "Say again?" "Chaplain's heading to the bird. On foot. No weapon. No escort. Silence." "Then, get the QRF moving. Now." Father Mike walked steady, not fast, not slow. His breathing was controlled. His hands didn't shake. The medical kit thumped against his hip with every step. The smoke grew closer, thicker, choking. Halfway there he heard the first scream. He didn't run. Running wastes energy. He walked faster, efficient, the way rangers move when bullets aren't flying yet. His eyes scanned the terrain. Open ground. No cover. If hostiles were watching, he was exposed. He didn't care. The wreckage was worse up close. The Black Hawk had shattered on impact, torn open like a tin can. Fuel burned in pools around the fuselage. Inside, men were trapped. Some unconscious, some screaming, some silent in the way that means time is running out. Father Mike stopped at the edge of the flames, assessed, and made his decision. He dropped the med kit, pulled off his jacket, wrapped it around his hands, and stepped into the fire. The first soldier was pinned under a seat. Conscious. Burned. Screaming. Father Mike knelt, evaluated the pinpoint, and with a single hard pull, freed him. The soldier collapsed. Father Mike checked his airway, breathing, pulse. Stable enough. He dragged him 20 feet from the wreck, laid him flat, moved back in. The second soldier was unconscious, bleeding from the head. Father Mike slung him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, muscle memory from 25 years ago, and walked him out. No hesitation. No wasted motion. The third soldier was trapped by twisted metal. Father Mike pulled a multi-tool from his med kit, cut through a seatbelt, pried the metal with his bare hands until it bent enough. The soldier screamed as he moved him. "I know," Father Mike said quietly. "I'm sorry. But I've got you." One by one he pulled them out. Fourth, fifth, sixth. The flames grew hotter. The smoke thicker. His hands were bleeding now, burned and torn. He didn't stop. Seventh, eighth, ninth. A soldier on the perimeter watching through binos radioed back. "You seeing this? The chaplain's pulling them out. One at a time. He's been in that fire for 8 minutes straight. Where's the QRF? 3 minutes out. He doesn't have 3 minutes." But Father Mike had carried heavier things than time. 10th soldier. 11th. By the time the QRF arrived, armored vehicles grinding to a halt in a cloud of dust, Father Mike was dragging the 12th man out of the wreckage. His face was black with soot. His hands were shredded. His shirt was burned through in places. But all 12 men were out. All 12 were breathing. He laid the last soldier down gently, checked his pulse, then sat back on his heels and coughed until his lungs cleared. Medics swarmed the scene, hauling stretchers, starting IVs, shouting vitals. Father Mike stood slowly, swaying for a second, then started helping. A medic grabbed his arm. "Sir, you need treatment." "Your hands?" "After," Father Mike said. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Triage the worst first." "I'll wait." The medic stared at him, then nodded. It took 20 minutes to stabilize everyone and load them into the medevac birds. Father Mike helped with every single one. Held pressure on wounds. Talked to the conscious ones. Prayed over the unconscious ones. When the last helicopter lifted off, he finally sat down in the dirt and let a medic wrap his hands. The QRF commander, a captain named Reese, walked over. He was a hard man, career infantry, not given to sentiment. He looked at Father Mike for a long time before speaking. "Chaplain, what the hell did we just watch?" Father Mike didn't answer. "You walked into a burning wreck. Unarmed. Alone. Pulled out 12 men. Some of them twice your size. How?" Father Mike looked at his bandaged hands. "I've had practice." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got, Captain." Reese stared at him, then nodded slowly. "All right. Let's get you back." They rode back in silence. When they reached the gate, soldiers lined the road. Not formation. Just watching. Word had spread. The chaplain. The one they called soft. The one they joked about. He'd walked into fire and pulled out 12 men. Father Mike climbed out of the vehicle and walked toward his quarters. His steps were slow now, exhaustion catching up. But as he passed, soldiers stepped aside. Not out of pity. Out of respect. That night, the base was quieter than usual. In the operations center, a major pulled Father Mike's file. What he found made him stop cold. 2 pages. Standard chaplain record. Education. Ordination. Duty stations. And then at the bottom, a note. Prior enlisted service. See attached. The major opened the attachment. His eyes went wide. The next morning, Father Mike woke to find the entire command staff outside his quarters. The colonel stood at the front, arms folded, expression unreadable. "Chaplain Hayes," the colonel said. "Or should I say Sergeant Hayes?" 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Distinguished Service Cross. Father Mike said nothing. You didn't think that was worth mentioning? It's not who I am anymore, sir. The hell it's not. The colonel stepped closer. You walked into a fire yesterday. Alone. Unarmed. Pulled out 12 men. That's exactly who you are. Father Mike looked down. With respect, sir, I'm trying to be someone different. Why? Because I've taken enough lives. I want to save them now. The colonel studied him for a long moment. Then he straightened and saluted. Sure. Formal. The kind of salute you give someone who's earned it. Chaplain Hayes, he said. On behalf of every man on this base, thank you. Father Mike returned the salute. Slowly. Painfully with bandaged hands. And for the first time in 25 years, he didn't feel like he was pretending. The days after were different. Soldiers didn't joke anymore. When Father Mike walked through the chow hall, conversations stopped. Not out of awkwardness. Out of acknowledgement. Men nodded. Some stood. One young private, overcome, walked up and said, My brother was on that bird, sir. You saved him. Thank you. Father Mike just nodded. I'm glad he's okay, son. But the word spread beyond the base. The story of the chaplain who'd walked into fire reached command. Reached the media. Reached families back home who'd been told their sons were alive because one man had refused to wait for the safe option. Awards were discussed. Medals. Recognition. Father Mike declined them all. I was doing my job, he said simply. Same as every medic, every soldier, every person who shows up when it matters. The colonel tried to argue. Father Mike was firm. If you want to honor what happened, honor the 12 men who survived. They're the story. Not me. So they did. A ceremony. All 12 soldiers, bandaged, limping, alive, stood together while their families watched via video link. The colonel read the account of the crash, the rescue, and the man who'd made it possible. We often think of courage as loud, the colonel said. Charging, shooting, fighting. But sometimes courage is quiet. It's walking into fire when no one's watching. It's carrying men when your hands are bleeding. It's choosing to save lives after you've spent years taking them. He looked at Father Mike. Chaplain Hayes, you reminded us what service really means. Father Mike stood in the back, silent, uncomfortable with the attention. But the 12 men wouldn't let him hide. One by one they walked to where he stood. And one by one they embraced him. No words. Just gratitude. The kind that doesn't need a speech. In the weeks that followed, the chapel filled. Not because soldiers suddenly found religion. But because they wanted to hear the man who'd proven that faith wasn't weakness. That quiet strength could move mountains. That the hand that prays can also pull you from fire. Father Mike didn't change his sermons. He still spoke softly. Still read from the same worn Bible. Still offered the same simple message. Love one another. Serve one another. Be the person who shows up. But now they listened. One evening, Torres, the young sergeant who'd asked how Father Mike stayed calm, came to the chapel. He sat down, quiet, wrestling with something. Father, he finally said, I've been thinking about what you said. About carrying weight. I get it now. Father Mike nodded. But how do you keep carrying it? How do you not break? Father Mike set his Bible down. You don't carry it alone. That's the secret. You let others help. You share the load. And you remember that the weight you carry, someone else carried it before you. And someone else will carry it after. Is that why you became a chaplain? To help carry it? Yes. Even after everything you did as a ranger? Especially after, Father Mike said. I spent years being the weapon. Now I want to be the healer. Both are necessary. But I've learned that healing takes more courage than hurting. Torres sat with that for a long time. Then he nodded. Thank you, Father. Anytime, son. Months later, Father Mike rotated home. The base held a farewell formation. Soldiers packed the yard, standing shoulder to shoulder. The colonel presented him with a plaque. Not a medal, Father Mike had refused those. But a plaque engraved with 12 names. The 12 men he'd saved. This is your legacy, Chaplain, the colonel said. Not the lives you took as a ranger. The lives you gave back as a man of faith. Father Mike accepted it, holding it carefully with hands that still bore scars. I'll treasure this, he said. And he meant it. As he walked toward the helicopter that would take him off the base, soldiers lined the path. Not formation. Just respect. And one by one they saluted. Father Mike returned every salute. Slowly. Carefully. With the same quiet dignity he'd carried every day. When the helicopter lifted off, he looked down at Camp Stryker one last time. Dust and tents and walls. A place where men had once dismissed him as soft. Where they'd learned the hard way that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it prays. And sometimes, when fire and fate converge, it walks into hell alone and brings 12 men home. Years later, those 12 men stayed in touch. They sent Father Mike letters. Photos of their families. Their children. Their lives continuing because he'd refused to wait. And every year on the anniversary of the crash, 12 families gathered. Not at a military base. At a small church where a soft-spoken chaplain served quietly, never seeking recognition, never needing it. Because Father Mike had learned the deepest truth of all. The greatest warriors aren't the ones who win battles. They're the ones who save lives. And sometimes, saving lives means being brave enough to stop fighting and start healing. Moral of the story: true strength isn't found in violence, but in the courage to heal, to serve, and to walk into fire for others. The greatest warriors are those who choose to save lives after learning how to take them. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories for more true tales of courage and sacrifice. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And remember, sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest burdens. Honor them. Until next time, stay strong, stay faithful, and never forget the heroes who serve in silence.